Start on time so that we can have a full program and end on time. Phil, you have a name tag there, all that I made for you, special. I've lost Bayla's, but you know, perfection is not my best thing. Okay, let me make some announcements. The bathrooms are across the hall, right? Just go out the door and go straight, a little bit to the left, and they're right out there. You should have a name tag, and I hope you've handed in your green ticket. You should have paid for your lunch here. They're very gracious about charging us only $10 for a buffet lunch. I don't know if you understand how inexpensive that is here in Cincinnati to have a buffet lunch that includes taxes and tip and stuff. We are very poor, and they give us the space for free, so we are very happy with these folks. Thank you to the Blue Gibbon. Liz Ping is not here today. Katie Hoffman, will you, in the back. Katie Hoffman is our person in charge of scheduling. She's the one who keeps on adding people, so that I had to, I made out 50 schedules of speakers of people coming, and then I had to handwrite the name of our governor candidate yesterday because she added another one.
Don't worry, I just added 2 more, so you know.
Oh shoot!
Don't make so many copies.
But I want people to know what's coming up. So take a list of the speakers that are coming up. I have them through the end of March. But we want to make sure that we get as many candidates in before the May primary, so that you are more informed about what's going on. Okay. We have this space until 2, so if you want to stay afterwards and join some of the groups that work here afterwards, please do. And if our speaker agrees to stay, you can come and get additional questions for him then, if he agrees to that. Our newsletter is going gangbusters. Peter, raise your hand. There's Peter. We have our own Peter Rose, folks. And he's doing gangbusters on our newsletter. If you want a newsletter, make sure you sign up with him. He will get you a very fine newsletter. Be sure to check our information over there. We have one of the best bars in the nation here. Belly up to our bar, please. Our non-alcoholic bar has not only name tags but has information. My brother has printed out some cartoons that he wanted to share. I have a free copy of the latest New York Times Magazine and a copy of the Cincinnati Herald, because I get them and they're 1 or 2 days old, and I want to share them in the community. I want to support our black paper here in town. Let's see, David Hughes. David Hughes over there in back. He's with his Mom's Demand Action. Just wave your hand, David Hughes. He's with Warder Park. Want to say anything about Warder?
Well, it's coming to a head. But Mom's Demand Action. Mom's Demand. There we go. Mom's Demand Action is for responsible gun legislation, and they did make a presentation here in November. They're having a meeting at City Hall, room 115, 1 o'clock on Saturday. Should be.
Saturday's a big day. Lots of things going on.
Should be good. So thank you.
Right.
Libby, over here. Libby.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
No, take the microphone.
Okay.
Libby.
Hi, I'm Libby Coletta. I'm here from Connie Pillage's campaign for governor, circulating nominating petitions today. So we'd love to have everybody sign so we can get to that 1,000 number. If you are not from Hamilton County, just flag me down and I'll make sure to give you a special sheet for another county.
There we go. Let's get people on the ballot. And
Microphone, please.
Dr. Weaver, all these doctors on the menu here.
Hi, I'm Laura Ann Weaver, and as many of you, or most of you know, I'm running for the U.S. House of Representatives against Steve Shabbat. We are having a town hall meeting on January 30th at the Esquire Theater from 7 to 9 p.m. So I can tell you who I am, what I'm about. You can ask me all the questions you want. I am not certainly a foreign person here. I'm very public. And I also have an opt-in list so I can start sending you my campaign stuff. We are getting a lot of hassle about not being allowed to send out emails because people have not opted in. And we just sent out a 13,000 email thing on my blog, and the carrier rejected it. So it's important that you sign an opt-in list so I can get these emails going to you.
Peter says he knows what that's like, just trying to send out emails from our group. It's been very difficult.
Yeah, so I'll be passing this
Right.
list around.
Okay, there we go. Other announcements?
Right here, Peter.
Peter?
Peter?
Just anyone who has an announcement that would be appropriate for the newsletter, please raise your hand, I'll bring you a card. Or if you didn't get the newsletter, and would like to get it, then I now know how to get the addresses in properly.
Are you using MailChimp? Using MailChimp then? MailChimp, the special program. Mr. Galloway?
Yes, I'm Dick Galloway, my wife Karen, we're presenting next week. The subject is constitutional amendment. What am I doing here? I guess I'm elected or something. So the idea is
No, don't talk, we can't hear.
it's going to take a constitutional amendment to get big money out of politics. We believe we have a path, and we believe that this is the year for change. It's in the air, and we're going to be talking about how we can make this issue a uniting issue for progressive actions across the board. Everybody benefits when we get big money out of government. So we hope we'll see you all. Bring your friends. Thank you.
I have two announcements. One, there was a scheduled meeting tomorrow of Span, Ohio, the hearing for House Bill 440. It has been canceled due to the sponsor being sick. So I just thought I'd let you know that. And I've also received just another email. Second one I've received about this issue. One came from Kathy Ingram. It's about redistricting. Let me just read this email to you. Hundreds of thousands of Ohioans have signed on in support of the fair congressional districts for Ohio plan. The campaign is on track to be put on the ballot this November so the voters can decide. And now Republicans in Columbus are trying to push through their own redistricting reform plan that does nothing to limit partisan gerrymandering. In fact, by specifically allowing Democratic counties to be split multiple times, among other sneaky things, their so-called reform would actually lock gerrymandering into Ohio's constitution forever. So, I have sent this email to Peter to include in the newsletter. There are phone numbers for you to call. This is a sneaky, under-the-table thing again. So it's very, very important because we can't get Ohio the way we need to have Ohio be when they're doing sneaky things like this.
They will rue the day.
Any other announcements?
Boy, this is hard with this feedback. I hope most of you will think about the death penalty in Ohio. It's awful. Harvard Law School just did a study. We have 25 people who are scheduled. Most of them have been beaten, sexually abused, mentally retarded, mentally ill. It's unbelievable. And Ohio to Stop Execution has a program that's going to be repeated 3 times in the next couple days. It's at the UC Law School at 5.
No, that's not the solution.
That's not the solution, we now have no microphone.
I'm gonna get somebody.
It's at Mount St. Joseph tomorrow at noon, about the death penalty in Ohio. And it's at Xavier tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. They're gonna have
Do you have something more specific if we come up and ask about it? Like,
it's a program about updating
yeah, but
people about the death
where
penalty.
on Xavier campus? Where?
Gallagher Hall at Xavier
Okay,
and Mount St. Joe.
Mount St. Joseph big campus.
It's their auditorium.
And the UC Law School tonight at 5.
Thank you.
Everybody gets signs?
Okay, this calls for teacher voice, thank you very much. There's a democracy at work for the Cincinnati Fire Museum. And just in case you don't think there's enough going on Saturday, there's a big League of Women Voters thing at Geyer Room in Presbyterian Church. We've also been invited, let me see. We've been invited to go to 2 different, no, there's one is left. If you want to know about the new voting machines that this county is looking at, the Board of Elections is inviting you to go to see the new voting machines, and I will find out where that is. But it's this Board of Elections on January 25th from 2 to 4 in Norwood. Everybody know where the new Board of Elections is? 4700 Smith. Also, there is naturalizations. Count them, 2 naturalizations. I have to tell you, I'm pretty proud of myself. A week ago Friday was a terrible day. You remember that terrible day? It was raining in the morning. They were going to have ice at lunch and then snow for the afternoon. Lots of places closed. It was a miserable cold day, and I knew nobody was going to show up for naturalizations down at the courthouse for 2 naturalization ceremonies. Ooh, this is possible. I have to tell you, I went alone for representing the League of Women Voters down at the court for the naturalizations, 2 naturalizations. I got 128 people registered to vote. I just want you to know, I felt really good about that. Now we have this opportunity again. The weather is not supposed to be that bad. I'm happy to have people come, and if you are interested in naturalization, please see me. I'll give you my card. I'll take you down the first time. I supply all the information. If you have a free day, please come. Bela, this would be an excellent thing for you to do on Friday if you're not busy. I actually drafted 2 little girls to help me to pass out pens and literature. They were 11 and 7, and they were so happy. Their father was being naturalized. He was coming in from Canada, and they were there, and they were so happy to help me. They took their picture. It's on my It's on my Facebook. Go see them. They're so cute. Okay. My brother Stanley is back there at the videographer. Hats. Bonnie is waving hats.
Lots of hats.
She has lots of hats.
We're going to be marching again in like 16, 17 days.
Marching again in 16 or 17 days, she says.
You know they're going to try to pull DACA out from under us.
They're going to pull DACA. We're going to have a march about DACA. Okay. Any other announcements? Other announcements? Other announcements? Going once, going twice. Okay. That brings us to our speaker for today. Our speaker for today is Michael Burrill, 2 R's and 2 L's. Graduate of Princeton University, Washington University in St. Louis, University of Cincinnati, and 3 defense managerial programs. And if that isn't good, it's really fine. He has a wonderful book. Real pretty book. Sustainable Transportation and Development, And he wants to work for a Grow Smart Planet. He encourages regions nationwide to create and expand rail and bus transit systems. And he's here today because those of us who have been here know that one of the things that Cincinnati needs almost more than anything is transportation to make us a more attractive group, more attractive city to more and different businesses, and to get all of our people who need to have better incomes. One of the things we need to do is transportation. So without further ado, Michael Burrill.
Let me first take this opportunity I'm supposed to hold this like this, sorry. Thank Peter Rose and Katie Hoffman for inviting me to speak to you. When I first introduced the idea of financing rail transit lines without raising taxes to Mayor Cranley a year ago, he of course first expressed dubious skepticism, but then said, who could be against that? Since then, I've launched a new website, growsmartplanet.org, to encourage cities like ours to plan transit-oriented, sustainable growth throughout the region and finance new rail and bus rapid transit lines that make that possible without raising taxes or waiting years for scarce federal funds. I hope you will find this idea compelling and will help me spread the word to everyone needed to help make this new funding approach feasible here. Cincinnati once had 222 miles of streetcar lines that were built much faster with local funds than the short downtown streetcar line opened in 2016. If we look closely at why voters here did not support the 2002 Metro News Regional Rail and Bus Transit Plan, you will see why I think we should try again now with an even better plan that provides fast, frequent service to all parts of the region. Public officials and transportation planners should seek consensus from diverse groups on questions like these on the screen when planning transportation systems. Their answers all impact what modes of transportation they will most likely support. Most people easily agree on just two things. They want someone else to pay for new highways or public transit lines, and they want lower taxes. Let's find out what you think. Okay, the first question. Do you think global warming is a real problem that is made worse by burning fossil fuels at home and on the road? Raise your hand.
Yes.
In a room of Republicans, it might not be so overwhelming. If, however, you hesitated to raise your hand, you may be among the millions of people who live in suburban homes with comfortable gas-fired furnaces and enjoy driving alone in a car for 82% of all trips. You may also think it is simply too hard to reduce your own carbon footprint. In Cincinnati, we moved from an almost new house only 10 miles from work to a much older house less than 2 miles away. At age 53, I started commuting uphill by bike for a decade and cut my driving in half. We added energy-efficient windows, light bulbs, insulation, and a high-efficiency furnace and air conditioner. Our carbon footprint will be lower when we buy an electric or hybrid car. Our carbon footprint would be even lower if we move back into our energy-efficient, all-electric townhouse in historic Fairfax, Virginia. I've lived happily there for 2 years without a car because I could walk to a nice grocery store, theaters, restaurants, and buses to the regional DC Metro rail system. I can cut the grass there in 15 minutes without using gas or electricity. Second question. Do you think we should simply put more buses on the road? Raise your hands if you are in favor of this. Well, only a few. Many people favor this because new buses cost less than new rail transit lines. Some of them think it can be done quickly without giving transit agencies more money. Unfortunately, this is not true. Do you think taxpayers should pay 70 to 75% of transit operating costs for bus riders?
No.
Some would say yes, some will say no to this one. Bus riders today nationwide and here pay about 28% of bus operating costs. Riders on faster regional rail lines and some fast bus routes pay a much higher share. If you want lower taxes, you should vote for transit vehicles that go faster than the 12 mile per hour average for buses on city streets. Do you think Cincinnati will ever have rail transit lines serving the entire region? No hands going up? Most people would say no, my wife. OKI began planning a modern regional rail system in 1993. Our first modern streetcar line finally opened 23 years later. Have you ever used transit regularly to get to work, school, or shopping? Oh, okay, pretty good response on that.
2 years ago.
Well, this is age limited, no restrictions on age, location, timing. I've been able to walk, ride a bike, or use transit half my life because I made a real effort to live close to the destinations I visited most often. Do you think someday you might be unable to drive a car?
Yeah.
A neck fracture a year ago has limited my ability to look right or left. That's why I'm doing this. And my wife thinks I can no longer drive safely. If we both become transit-dependent riders someday, we might have to move back to a city that already has a regional rail system where we happen to own a house. Finally, this is the hard one. Should public officials encourage private firms like Amazon to come to their cities or remain there by offering tax breaks?
No.
Like stadiums.
No.
Most cities do this now, even though it greatly reduces tax revenues they need for schools and other public services. Some cities, however, attract new businesses and residents by offering a high quality of life, good schools, and a fast regional transit system instead. Developers there know compact, high-density growth near transit reduces costs for construction and parking and makes their projects more attractive and profitable. I arrived in Cincinnati in 1993 to work on capital budgets at UC and began work that fall on a master's degree in community planning. Just as our regional planning agency, OKI, was beginning study of several transportation corridors. Our graduate planning class completed the first study of the Eastern Corridor, or OASIS, commuter rail line along the river in 1993. That's this one. The weekly route to Batavia. My analysis of ridership for this study concluded that densities along this route were far too low to justify frequent service. Even if new riverfront attractions like those in our plan were built. Our plan won a national award from the American Planning Association a few months later. I also prepared my first regional multi-mode transportation plan in 1993 and sent this updated version to OKI 3 years later. Both plans included a more direct rail line to Milford and Batavia via Uptown and Hyde Park that would connect two UC campuses to each other and downtown. A new line to Madisonville, Madeira, and Loveland that would make good use of two existing rail stations and a little-used dual-track main line. This is the line that would have gone via what is now called the Wasson route out to Batavia through Uptown, and this is the one to Loveland and Madeira. The Wasson route is now becoming a bike trail, as many of you know. North-south lines in I-75 and I-71 corridors, similar to those that OKI was thinking of planning, would also link the suburbs to downtown and riverfront attractions and northern Kentucky through Uptown. I did have a slight bias for Uptown, as you might anticipate. A rail line in the I-74 corridor serving some West Side communities. Bus rapid transit lines providing fast crosstown service on main highways. And bus routes that would provide one-seat rides from Ohio to northern Kentucky. Don't need two transit agencies if you just want to go from Northgate to NKU, for example. OKI, meanwhile, was working on several corridor plans in the same time frame, 93 to 2004. They focused primarily on the eastern and I-71 corridors in the 90s, even though many people thought congestion on I-75 was much higher and a rail line serving that area would attract more riders if it was built first. Current plans for the eastern corridor still project low ridership on diesel-powered commuter train sets that would operate mainly at rush hours. This line was still seeking funds in 2017, despite very low capital cost per mile. The light rail line proposed for the I-71 corridor in 1998 would have connected Kings Island and Mason to Uptown, Downtown, the airport, and Florence. It would have provided fast service on a 33-mile route that included a short tunnel between downtown and uptown with an underground station at Christ Hospital. Portland, Oregon had recently opened a light rail line with a much longer tunnel. When the 2002 Metro Moves plan was released to the public in June, the fast light rail lines bypassed Uptown, and the tunnel was deleted. Riders to Uptown would have to transfer to a slower streetcar line. OKI's study of the I-75 corridor was still in progress in November when Hamilton County voters were asked to vote on the 2002 Metro Moves plan. Most of the focus in I-75 corridor was on highway widening, now nearing completion. This slide shows the I-71 corridor light rail line proposed by OKI in 1998 that proposed direct service to both downtown and uptown. Public officials in this corridor approved this mode choice and route about 2 years later. This slide shows rail lines in the 2002 Metro News plan. Note that the I-71 corridor light rail line shown in green and the I-75 corridor line shown in red both bypass Uptown. Riders on these lines would have to transfer to slower streetcars on the line shown in yellow to reach UC and nearby neighborhoods. There were no rail lines from Uptown to West Side neighborhoods. The Uptown area, with about 40,000 workers, had become a hole in the middle of the donut. In June, UC officials showed Metro an alternative plan I developed that instead envisioned the intersection of Martin Luther King Avenue and Jefferson Vine as the center of the crosshairs of a regional rail transit system that would attract commuters to Uptown as well as the 80,000 jobs located downtown. We were not surprised when Metro responded that it was simply too late to change their plan. I was not surprised when many of the 40,000 commuters to Uptown decided not to support the 2002 Metro News plan.
Was that before or after EPA was there?
Well after EPA was there. EPA building looks like it was built about the 60s, just as our Crosley Tower. Or less than beautiful Crosley Tower. Brittleless concrete, same architects. This slide summarizes the cost, phasing, projected riders, capital cost per rider of the 189 miles of rail lines in the Metro News plan. The plan also included major expansion of bus routes in the suburbs, not unlike those that I had proposed earlier. Note that the light rail lines would open in phases between 2013 and 2031. They would have a much lower capital cost per rider than the commuter rail lines that had a much lower cost per mile. Why? More riders. The total capital cost in 2020 dollars was $9.9 billion. You want sticker shock? That's a big number. This was more than twice the estimated cost if the entire rail transit system had been locally funded and ready to bid in 2002. Most voters are unlikely to support any plan that takes 30 years to complete, even if there are no funding delays, especially if they live near lines in the later phases. Only voters in Hamilton County were asked to vote on the Metro News plan, even though voters in other parts of the region were most likely to benefit from a regional rail plan. Gas prices were still relatively low in 2002. And I think most important, but little discussed, the plans developed by OKI and Metro did not include plans for development near the new lines or estimate tax revenues from those projects. This potential funding source was not considered. A year after the Metro Moves referendum failed, Citizens for Civic Renewal held a forum seeking inputs on what our city should do next. My slides showing the pros and cons of all major surface transportation modes gave attendees a broader understanding of the many choices than those considered previously. Most important, we asked attendees to vote their preferences after each group of slides and show the results on screen immediately. The consensus was that modern streetcars like those in Europe had great potential, because they could operate safely at slow speeds on city streets, but could also go much faster on dedicated routes in the suburbs, almost as fast as rapid transit lines. This flexibility is what makes light rail or streetcar lines in Portland, San Diego, Sacramento, and many other cities good solutions for relatively low-density corridors. Keep in mind that light rail is simply shorthand for light-capacity rail transit, with streetcars simply one type of vehicle powered by overhead wires. Rail transit riders usually pay a higher share of operating costs than bus riders, except in cities like Portland, where fares are kept low to attract more riders. In the next 10 years, I studied more than 600 transit lines from a mobility, environmental, and fiscal perspective. I especially wanted to learn how much development each line and transit mode attracted. I suspected the answers would help cities like ours fund new lines and encourage smart growth. My 2014 book, which you can look at afterwards, summarizes the results. Last year, I ordered 25 copies of the book and wrote a small, short smart growth overview that summarizes major findings. You can read both for free on my website or order printed copies at prices that cover my printing and mailing costs. In March of 2014, a Cincinnati Enquirer invited me to speak at a forum on transportation options downtown. My presentation included the next 6 slides, which focused on the lower cost modes still being planned here. This slide illustrates attractive, modern European streetcars that run at slower speeds downtown and much faster in the suburbs. The example on the right is in Barcelona, with vehicles made by the same company that made our streetcars here. Of course, I would recommend we buy streetcars that work well in cold weather. Maybe Siemens and the French do better than the Spanish in this regard. Note that capital costs per rider are much lower than for other modes because the European streetcar lines attract many more riders per mile. When a line attracts more riders, it is easy to simply add modules or provide more frequent service. When you do either one, drivers serve more passengers per mile or per hour, and riders pay a much higher share of operating costs. It is harder to add modules to the high-floor light rail vehicles designed in the 80s for cities like Sacramento, where our family also has a home, but the trains there are much longer now than when the line first opened, and I rode them recently. The Health Line in Cleveland and the Orange Line in Los Angeles are often cited as our most successful bus rapid transit lines. But the 12-mile-per-hour speed of the Health Line with stops was about the same as conventional buses on most city streets. The Orange Line in LA operates on dedicated lanes in the suburbs and is about 50% faster, but not as fast as most light rail or rapid transit rail lines. It's pretty hard to get people excited about going 17 miles an hour. Capital costs per rider were much higher than the modern European streetcars we just looked at that attracted 5 to 7 times as many riders per mile in the same time frame. Diesel-powered commuter rail train sets offer a much faster service in suburban corridors than buses or streetcars on city streets because they have fewer stops. But this adversely impacts their ability to attract riders or development. Capital costs per mile are lower than electric-powered light rail vehicles, but these lines typically operate mostly during rush hours and do not attract as many riders per mile. The 5-mile long line in Ottawa, which I rode and took this picture a few years ago, connects a popular bus rapid transit corridor to the large university there and attracts more riders per mile than most commuter rail lines. Capital costs were low because the existing track was in good shape. And you see on the bottom, Cincinnati Eastern Corridor figures with a very high capital cost per rider, as planned as of 4 years ago. This drawing illustrates my 2014 proposal to link downtown to uptown and our suburbs with modern low-floor modular streetcars or light rail vehicles that would operate at slower speeds in urban areas and much faster on dedicated lanes in the suburbs, just like those in Europe, Portland, and Sacramento. The intersection of Martin Luther King and Jefferson Vine is close to the geographic center of the region, the center of the crosshairs in the rail system. Right there. Get to the zoo, go east, go west, go north, south. If Clifton would let us, we'd go down Ludlow Avenue. If not, that way, out to existing rail corridors via Xavier. The intersection of Martin Luther King and Jefferson Vine would function much like the Metro Center area does in downtown Washington, D.C. Riders could transfer to other lines there or in other locations easily. Here's the key. With only one rail transit mode serving the region, the only reason riders would have to transfer from one rail line to another would be to change direction. With more one-seat rides, the rail system would attract many more riders. This plan would also include bus rapid transit routes on major highways and arterial roads to link suburbs to each other and to radial rail lines. Some crosstown routes could also be served by modern streetcars. This slide was my first attempt to illustrate the high cost of waiting to receive federal funds that in 2014 would pay no more than 50% of capital costs. It's more like 25% today. It also summarized the amount of transit-oriented development near several modern streetcar lines, including our Cincinnati line that opened 2 years after I did this slide. It also estimates 30 years of property and income tax revenues from transit-oriented development, or TOD, using median incomes of only $40,000 per household and a 2% rate. The results are many times the capital cost of modern light rail lines, without including sales taxes. In the bottom of the slide, you will see my 2014 estimates of the billions of dollars in savings that compact smart growth near transit lines yields in a region of almost 2 million people like ours. The savings in school costs will surprise most people. They occur because new housing units in TOD zones have fewer school children than single-family homes in most suburbs. My research found that 65 transit lines of the roughly 600 I studied had high levels of transit-oriented development, or TOD, at least $100 million per mile. In 40 years, the Orange Rapid Transit line in Arlington, Virginia attracted $5.9 billion in development per mile to the 2.5 miles between Boston and the Potomac River, with well over 70,000 jobs, bigger than many city downtowns. The county wisely invested $300 million of its own money to help pay for an underground line and strongly encourage higher density development above it in the 70s, including a handsome new building for county offices near one metro stop, which you can see on the cover of my book. The county increased allowable densities on only 11% of the land in this small county. The rest of it still looks a lot like it did when we lived there in the 1950s. The modern streetcar and light rail lines shown on this slide attracted up to $1.2 billion in TOD per mile in much shorter time frames. Growth near them continues. The bus rapid transit lines in Cleveland and Boston also attracted high levels of development. Some of the projects in Cleveland were for institutions like hospitals that would have been built anyway. The Silver Line in Boston connects the airport to riverfront attractions, a new downtown convention center, and a station with commuter trains and trains to New York. Buses are very crowded. A light rail or rapid transit line would probably have been better. This slide shows what developers could build in 2017 with $100 million. Note that offices and retail space attract more taxpayers, adults, than residential projects. Projects with more than 200 square feet per person, which is the number I used here, would have fewer taxpayers. You could use 300 and you'd get about 1,200 taxpayers instead. Higher density apartment and townhouse projects attract more adults than single-family subdivisions. To simplify calculations on the next two slides and to be conservative, I assume residential projects would average only 400 tax-paying adults. I've used these estimates to project tax revenues at existing Hamilton County tax rates for transit lines that attract $1 billion in development per mile. This slide estimates 30 years of property and income tax revenues from $1 billion in office retail development near new light rail or modern streetcar lines. The number of taxpayers is simply 10 times the number on the previous slide for an investment of $100 million. Tax rates and median incomes are those cited for Hamilton County on the website taxrates.org. Note that the $2.2 billion total figure is almost 18 times the capital cost of $125 million per mile I would recommend for light rail lines built on grade in 2020. Modern streetcar and bus rapid transit lines usually cost less. If you want to be very conservative and assume that new light rail lines would only attract $500 million in TOD per mile, total revenues of $1.1 billion would still be almost 9 times the capital cost of light rail transit lines. This slide estimates 30 years of property, income, and sales tax revenues from $1 billion in residential development. The estimate of 4,000 taxpayers is simply 10 times the number of adults in a $100 million housing, low-density housing project. Townhouse and apartment projects will likely have more taxpayers. Since the total revenues of note that the total revenues of $1.1 billion per mile would still be almost 9 times the capital cost of new light rail transit lines. Of course, when you're planning a line and designating development, you'll have a mix of office, retail, and residential. I hope the last two slides have convinced you that we can afford to locally finance new light rail transit lines without raising taxes, if we also encourage high-density smart growth in TOD zones near the lines. Tax revenues from TOD can be used to pay off bonds, used to build the lines in just a few years. After that, they're the gift that keeps on giving. This slide summarizes what regions should do to encourage transit-oriented smart growth. Not only do they have to develop or update plans for regional rail and bus transit lines, they have to clearly define TOD zones where higher density growth is encouraged and parking requirements are lower. Regions also have to select transit modes that will attract more riders per mile and provide fast, frequent service to all parts of the region. Riders will be more likely to pay most or all of the operating costs to ride them with lower taxpayer subsidies if they take one-seat rides or only transfer once. Regions will need to use only some of the tax revenues from new businesses and new taxpayers near new transit lines to pay off the bonds used to build them in just a few years. These revenues keep flowing afterwards to help balance budgets. Tax revenues from existing residents and businesses, including those within TOD zones, can still be used for other public functions like schools. This is why my funding proposal differs from tax increment financing districts where everyone inside the district must pay higher taxes to fund projects. After the bonds for new transit lines are paid off, regions can consider reducing tax rates for everyone, like Arlington and other Northern Virginia jurisdictions have done. Our property taxes in Northern Virginia are around 1%. Less than half of the 2.5% we now pay in Cincinnati. Regions should finance lines locally to get rail lines built much sooner, at a much lower cost, and not wait years for federal funds. Do you think Cincinnati taxpayers should send tax dollars to Washington to pay for high-cost rapid transit lines in other cities? This is what we do now. Finally, we need to convince developers that projects in TOD zones do not need tax breaks to be profitable. The new transit lines bring employers and customers to their projects and reduce or eliminate the need for parking garages that now cost about $30,000 per space or more. If you have any doubts about this, let me quote one developer whose firm is now building projects in underserved, lower density areas in Brooklyn and East New York. We put density where there's transit. When he was asked if developers would help pay for subway upgrades, he said, "Oh yeah, it's just math. You can make money come right out of the air with a pencil." Cities just need to change zoning to do it. If you'd like to learn more, please take one of my cards on the table here. Check out my website and take an hour to read the Smart Growth Overview posted there. I'm ready to answer any questions you may have.
I'm wondering who's stopping all this stuff that we could have. It seems like if we just started with fast rail from Mason downtown or Westchester or along 75, have a bus lane or something, it would help a lot. Just just starting there. But who and what is stopping them?
Well, I think the idea of just doing one line and prove that it works is what was behind the streetcar proposal. It only got funded at half of the length it was supposed to be. It was supposed to come up the hill to UC, and then our friendly governor decided that wouldn't be a good deal. It's a streetcar that doesn't go very far or anywhere, in the opinion of some. You have to connect the suburbs. That's why I was particularly interested in the Loveland Madeira route, because it was existing dual-track mainline corridor with 2 existing stations, and I'm pretty sure that's the route my B&O train took to Washington in 1962 when I first came to this city.
Yes.
So yeah, but the whole idea here is people are afraid to do something big. Make no little plans, Mr. Vernon said in Chicago. We don't seem to want to do that here, but you could pick a very good route that would prove that it would work. And I would hope that that route would go through Uptown.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned light rail in Brooklyn, particularly East New York. This is pretty flat country, and it's also serviced by 2 separate subway systems already. While Queens is not serviced at all, or hardly serviced. It has a lot of single home dwellings. I question whether or not that can adequately serve Cincinnati with all of its hills. Will you be able to get, because you mentioned on level track. Cincinnati is hardly level. We have Mount Adams, we have Bond Hill, we have College Hill, all of which have elevations several hundred feet above the city center. Can you comment on the cost of that, and can we depend upon future development to pay the bonds off for the costs that you're proposing?
Yeah, before I answer that very good question, let me point out that the developer I quoted at the end in East New York was developing projects near the rapid transit lines that were already there within a mile or 2, and he had to go get the zoning changed to allow mixed-use development. And if you have rapid transit lines, it's much easier to get big numbers in terms of development return. I'm not sure we could convince people here to support a rapid transit system like the subways we started to build in the 20s and get an even higher return in terms of development. That's what Arlington did. But there's, as I showed on my slide, several light rail cities and streetcar cities, Portland among them, that got close to $1 billion per mile in the first 10 years by building on-grade lines that had service that people were happy to use. And that's the key. You know, if you bypass places where people live, the ridership will be low in an effort to get, a faster line that happens to use an existing rail track. So Loveland and Madeira is not the best choice from that point of view. But if you built a lot of stuff near it, which is the whole idea behind my funding plan, then the city would be quite different than it is today. You have to plan the transit-oriented growth. Don't just build a line and hope the developers will show up. In Arlington, they said, we salute the transit flag every morning. But they had a strong economic development department encouraging growth near the lines for 40 years, and that's where 70,000 jobs came from. John.
Thank you, Mr. Burrill. You said regional transportation.
Yes.
And we're the Greater Cincinnati Democrats, and I keep hearing the mayor and talk about the city, Cincinnati. But you're talking about a regional transportation. So how do we get support as Greater Cincinnati Democrats for a regional?
Here.
Well, what OKI did in the 90s, within the restraints imposed by the Federal Transit Administration, is this studied several corridors, beginning with I-75 and the Eastern Corridor. They followed all of their detailed rules and had a zillion meetings. I went to probably 100 meetings at OKI, our regional planning agency, and they took the lead. And there were people from all parts of the region, anywhere near those lines, coming to the meetings. That's how to do it. Since Jim Duane left, we have had very little interest in regional rail at OKI. We need to convince OKI that this has got potential, and here's how you could fund it. You don't have to wait 30 years to get it built. And do the same with the Chamber of Commerce. I was working with a business group called the Alliance for Regional Transit that was an offshoot of the Chamber of Commerce for about 8 or 10 years, and they were strong supporters of the Metro News plan, and I was just one of 20 worker bees on this little advisory body. They didn't ask if I was a Democrat or a Republican. I was viewed as the technical guru who knew something about various modes. But you know, we had a big meeting before they decided to put it for a vote in the Chamber of Commerce downtown. And they said, well, is this a realistic cost estimate? $40 million per mile was then the cost estimate for light rail lines. And I said, yes, it compares favorably to what's been built recently in other cities.
So I remember a long time ago when Dick Celeste was governor of Ohio, and his wife Dagmar was, I guess, from Germany or someplace, and so they had a lot of familiarity with rail systems in Europe. And they wanted to create a statewide rail system to serve like 9 different cities. And it sounded great, it made a lot of sense, it was very exciting. Never went anywhere. And as you mentioned, with our streetcar, we had something like $100 million extra from the federal government that was supposed to bring the streetcar to Uptown and to all that employment and you know, the university, the hospitals, and all of that. And then the governor decided to divert that money somewhere else. I think it was Cleveland, but I'm not sure exactly. And then our mayor ran for election against the streetcar by pitting 50 neighborhoods against 2 neighborhoods, which he said it would only serve the 2 neighborhoods, right? So it's an uphill battle, no pun intended, because the grades here, as were mentioned, really do create a problem. It's, you know, that's why Vine Street is I guess it's the principal route that's been looked at to get up to Uptown, because it's the least amount of grade, I believe. But what I really wanted to ask you about is some alternatives. Have you been to Denver?
Yes.
So you've seen it's a fixed route, little sunken area, but it's not rail. It runs on tires. It's a transit system that's much less expensive to build per mile.
You're talking the 16th Street downtown corridor?
That one that goes north and south, that, you know, and it's free also, which is kind of wonderful. So, and then the hybrid. Have you been to our sister city, Nancy, France? They have a streetcar that's a hybrid. It runs on tires, but there's a central rail. So it's a fixed route, which builds the development as well. But if there's a problem, they can just take it right off the rail and drive around the problem and get back on the tracks. They can drive on the streets too. Have you looked at some of these alternatives? And then one other one I was thinking, and I don't know any place that has it, but instead of overhead lines, an electric streetcar where you charge it up every night and it runs without overhead lines. And I would imagine that's less expensive than the overhead electrical system.
Yeah. My book has several examples of vehicles like that, and I don't want to get into all the pros and cons of the technical details. You might spend $5 million per mile, which is relatively low, to electrify any rail line, so the cost of providing a rail line that has electric instead of diesel-powered commuter rail is not that outrageous compared to the total cost of the system. Someone mentioned before the meeting trackless trolleys, buses that have electric wires, and in San Francisco and other places that have a few hills where I've also lived. And I moved in Germany too, by the way, for 4 years.
But those are cable cars, and that's
No. These are buses that have overhead wires, and they have them in Germany, just like you just described, that run on dedicated corridors, and then they can go towards the end of the route to serve areas that, like any bus does.
And do those generate the kind of TOD that other fixed route systems generate?
I don't have any good figures on TOD for any of those systems. They were not the high performers. But, you know, I mentioned that in the book, and the Smart Growth Star 1 o'clock time frame.
Might be off.
Did I answer my question? I understand that there are underground tunnels in Cincinnati. Are any of them viable?
I would say no. I've been through them a little bit. I have a hard time getting excited about them because they're sharp turns. New York City built much of their rapid transit system in the same time frame, and they have now an estimate of, get this, $100 million to rebuild their system. And one of the things they need to do is to fix the sharp turns on their tunnels. And somehow, I don't get too excited about tunnels that go from downtown to Norwood. They didn't quite make it that far. They stopped at Hopple Street. So it's, to me, a sunk investment. We goofed. We didn't build it. And I think it's too late to make good use of it.
And it's also got a huge water main in that.
Yeah, and so the cities say, well, let's use this for something, and they filled it up. It's just like my route to the east side that's now becoming a bus lane. It didn't act fast enough. And I like bikes too. Remember, I was biking to work for 10 years.
Let's hear it. Mike Burrill.
Thank you very much.
I lived in places with really good mass transit in Helsinki and in Frankfurt, and man, it's really easy to get around those places. I would love to have that happening here so that more people had a chance to get to jobs and have an opportunity to get around the city and to be employed in different places than they are now. So thank you for working on this, and thank you for being so dedicated over the years, and gee, I hope it can happen. Let's have some intelligent, I feel overwhelmed by today. I feel like it's really complicated, but it needs to happen. And folks, even though today was tough listening to all the TODs and stuff, I think all of us need to know that what we need in the city is more transit. It needs to be happening. I have a couple of announcements. Food, we have leftover food. Make sure the food goes. Anything that is left here is you can take home. Put their take-home little styrofoam containers there for you to pack things in. We have some wonderful speakers coming up. Move to Amend is next week with our own Karen and Dick Galloway. Yes. Oh, I'm so excited. And then comes P.G. Sittenfeld. So any of you who have any problems with city council, please come.
This will be on education though.
Oh, it's going to be on education.
That will be the week that the Betsy DeVos report card will be released.
Right, and we're not going to get all upset about tax abatements. Okay, yeah, well, we could. Clean Cincinnati report is the third week away with Oliver Kroner. We have good things coming up. Please come back. We'd love to see you here.
What I think is very interesting about Oliver Kroner, he just went to Germany and
Did
presented
the
this
Green
report
Cincinnati
about
report?
Clean Cincinnati. The report that he presented in Germany. I haven't heard it, have you? But Germany's heard it.
Germany's heard this report, but we haven't. It's not Clean Cincinnati report, it's Green Cincinnati report? Don't ask me.
Well, same thing.
Same thing. Okay, please come back. Take our most recent handout, upcoming speakers through the end of March. Finish off the food. Have a nice day. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I mean, there's cities like San Diego, Atlanta, you go to visit them, you see stuff being built everywhere, but they didn't bother to record the development. So there's many more than 65 cities that have done a good job here. But when I was writing the book, I had to rely on facts that I could then get that were reported. And as far as our hills here, that's why I liked the original I-71 corridor plan. It had a short tunnel. You'd go up Main Street, plow through the hill that you run into there instead of going left over to Vine. Next thing you know, you're at Christ Hospital, and the next thing you know, you're at UC, and it's much faster than the current bus routes would have been, and I still think is a very viable approach. I think Metro got cold feet on the cost of that tunnel. I realize